Chris Brown, take me inside where things stand. We are not unique in having people who become disgruntled in the workplace, but we are unique in that any disgruntled anybody over anything can get a gun and easily act on their instability or rage. Where are we? Are we at a crossroads? Are we at the end of the beginning? Are we at the beginning of doing something different? Or is this the way it is?
Well, I'm really glad to see my friend David Jolly, who I talked with many times when he was a member of Congress about just this issue, whose voice is honestly really important at this moment in time. We are at an inflection point. Look, we have achieved a ton as the gun violence prevention movement to save lives. We have 19 states and the District of Columbia that have passed really meaningful laws. We just passed, and it didn't happen in 30 years, but it did happen under Joe Biden's watch, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And I don't want to take away from how horrible these incidents are. And we've had 3 public ones, many more than that we're not talking about, to be honest, that have gripped our consciousness. But the things we've done matter. What we have to focus on, looking at this particular incident and Colorado Springs and UVA, which is just a little more than a week ago, is what are the right combination of factors that we could bring to bear that could actually save lives? And I'll offer 2, because they're before the Senate in the lame duck, Nicole, and I'd love to hear other people talk about this. One is expanding the Brady background check system. It's cuckoo. It's crazy that it's not expanded across all states, but half of states let people buy guns online who are felons and purchase them in whatever category, however they want. We need to close that loophole. It's killing people every day. Maybe not here, but of the 600 mass shootings that are among what we hear about, there are many people who died there. The second is, let's end sales of assault weapons in America. The House of Representatives passed a bill that's pending before the Senate. This Senate now, before January, early January, could actually take up that bill. And I would call on Leader Schumer to do that. We must have that happen. Joe Biden said he would sign that. And this isn't easy. I understand all of that. It is complicated. But if you look across America, there are people reeling from this horrible shooting, from the one we had a few days ago in Colorado Springs, from UVA, and the many before that. They don't know, as they're approaching Thanksgiving, neither do I, as I shop for my daughters and my stepsons, where am I safe? And we can't actually think about ourselves as a country that are the land of the free and home of the brave if we don't solve this. The solutions are before us, and we've got to take it up.
I mean, David Jolly, none of those things should be polarizing or politically difficult votes. They all have, I think, 85% approval or higher on background checks. Assault weapons ban is upwards of 67%, I think, approval rating. None of them are polarizing, but no one thinks any of them will happen in a Republican-controlled House. And I guess my question for you is, it's so perverse. And what is so clear is that, I mean, who feels safe and where? Not in your house of worship, not in your Jewish preschool, not in your grocery store, not in your elementary school. And you keep thinking that something breaks the fever of absolute bat bleep lunacy. Like, oh, an elementary school is shut up. Surely something will change. Nothing ever changes. What is the perversion on the right to doing any of these things?
Well, the raw politics of it, Nicole, is those numbers of 80 to 85% don't translate to a closed primary in a Republican gerrymandered district where only 10% of your most ardent ideological Republican voters express their wishes. And you're seeing members of Congress respond to that. Part of it is responding to incentives. But, you know, that actually is giving Republican politicians too much credit, as though that's an excuse, and it's not, because the failure to responsibly address gun violence in America is one of the greatest shames of modern American culture, without question. And you can say that part of it is needing to change hearts and minds. That's true. Everybody can have an opinion on that. But we also know one truism in all of this is we have a failure of federal gun policy in the United States that continues to result in the tragedies we see. And so the raw politics of it are one party is trying to do something about it and the other is not. And we just have to be honest about that. It's never too soon to talk about political accountability. And I appreciate Chris's kind words. Our meeting actually began in an adversarial way. As a Republican who had bought into much of the Republican dogma, I started to test a theory in politics, Nicole, that is it okay to change your mind? And I think we all have to ask ourselves that. Is it okay to change your mind in politics? And that led to a meeting with Chris over the universal background check bill. And not only did I join with Democrats in the more moderate background check, if you will, I became the only Republican to sign on to the more aggressive, or I think more aggressive than even some Democrats wanted to go, background bill, because Chris and I established a relationship on this very question. How do we crush the culture of guns on demand in the United States that is resulting in the tragedy and loss of lives? It is a shameful moment in modern American culture every time we see the news like we saw last night.
Yeah, and Barbara, it's so far out of the mainstream. Most legal gun owners have to jump through all sorts of hoops to obtain a permit, to purchase ammunition. I mean, we're talking about such an extreme policy that thinks that people with felonies on their record, people with domestic violence in their record, people with no record at all should be able to get their hands on weapons of war. Is there a more forceful role for law enforcement to play in saying, hey, we're not safe with all these guns out there?
Your law enforcement point, Nicole, is a very good one. If you were to talk to police officers who care about public safety and their own lives, they do not favor having assault weapons in the hands of ordinary citizens. Assault weapons are created for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to kill other people. On the battlefield, they have a purpose. On our streets, they can only create death. And so for that reason, I think supporting an assault weapons ban is a really important step to reducing gun violence. Now, why can't we get it done when so many Americans support it? I think it is because of this tribal nature we now have in politics, where it is a signal that you are a member of the tribe if you support not just gun rights, not just the right to carry a handgun to defend oneself and one's home, but to carry the most aggressive looking gun you can find. You know, think about these members of Congress who pose with all their children and family members on their holiday cards, showing off their assault weapons. It's a way to pose that they're a member of the far right tribe. And I think we need to crack past that so that people are talking rationally about policy and not so much about signaling their virtue to members of their own tribe.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's what's her name, Lauren Boebert, who did that. It's an abomination, this photo of really small kids holding weapons of war in a holiday card. It's not as pretty a holiday scene as what David Jolly's in front of, but it is just this incredible signaling of a culture that celebrates these unbelievable weapons in the hands of small children. How do you beat back that kind of culture? Chris.
Oh, sorry. Well, a number of ways. Look, ultimately, if you look at the polling across this country, we have huge unanimity around the solutions. It's not actually controversial, right? 94% of Americans support expanded Brady background checks. Over 80% of Americans think that things like extreme risk laws, those laws that remove guns from dangerous people, should happen. And more than a majority believe that we should remove assault weapons from those who, from everyone. What we haven't really focused on, and your question really gets at, Nicole, which I think is quite important, is what is the role of influencers in creating an environment where they are potentially inciting others to violence? And we see this. I think that's part of the question that you're asking. And among the mass shootings that we've experienced, let's think about this. UVA, which is 2 hours from my home, and I have parents who were texting me whose kids were in lockdown for 24 hours. My daughter was going to go there. She's not there. She was going to be a freshman. That is terrifying. And we have amazing people who lost their lives. Colorado Springs. And now we have this horrible situation at Walmart. What people want to know is, how and where are we safe? And I think we have to ask ourselves as Americans who care about living in a democracy, who care about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that should involve being grocery shopping at a Walmart before Thanksgiving and not being shot. It should involve going to a club. It should involve being on a bus for a school trip. What kind of world do we want? And the answer to that unanimously across this country is basic public safety measures. The only people standing in the way are those beholden to the gun industry, but they're not doing the service of their constituents. They are doing the service of the gun industry. David Jolly, as a champion, and I'm not trying just to curry favor, but he's one of the few, knows that well. And we need more people like him who stand up, who do the right thing, and in public service actually really decide they're standing up for our safety, because we are at an inflection point. And it's the safety, not just for, this is not theoretical, it's about our kids.